A mayor's 26-year-old daughter slapped a 60-year-old woman across the face in front of 43 witnesses at the most expensive restaurant in Caldwell Heights for the crime of sitting in a section she'd decided didn't belong to someone who looked like her. What Brielle Ashford didn't know was that the woman touching her own face with steady, unshaking fingers had spent 35 years building toward exactly this kind of room, ever since the year she'd been the one nobody believed. The phone call that followed lasted 31 seconds. It would end her father's career inside of 8 days. To understand why Dr. Vivian Holloway Price didn't flinch when that hand came across her face, we have to go back 35 years to a younger version of her, fired for telling the truth, and the 8 years it took anyone to admit she'd been right. Vivian Holloway Price had been 25 years old, 3 years into her first job in municipal finance, when she found the discrepancy, a line item in a public works budget that didn't reconcile, traced backward through invoices until it led somewhere it shouldn't have led. She did exactly what the employee handbook told her to do. She reported it through proper channels. The proper channels closed around her like a hand. Within a week, she was terminated for what her supervisor called performance concerns that had never once appeared in any prior review. It took 8 years for the truth to surface, through other means, through other people willing to risk what she'd already lost. By the time the officials she'd named were finally indicted, Vivian had spent most of her 20s unable to find steady work in the field she'd trained for, treated by an entire professional community as someone who'd made trouble rather than someone who'd been right. She did not let that experience curdle into bitterness, exactly. She let it become a discipline instead, the long, deliberate kind that takes decades to fully assemble. She went back to school. She built a reputation, slowly, in spaces nobody else wanted to work. Institutional fraud, municipal corruption, the kind of investigations that took years and made enemies and rarely earned anyone headlines. By 60, Dr. Vivian Holloway Price had spent 35 years becoming the person she had once needed and couldn't find. She kept one photograph from that earlier life tucked in a wooden box she rarely opened, herself at 25, standing outside the municipal building on the day of her termination, her face composed in a way that she could now recognize had cost her something to maintain. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. Vivian returned to Caldwell Heights on a Tuesday, which she had always considered the most honest day of the week, not Monday's false optimism, not Friday's relief, just Tuesday, plain and asking nothing of you except that you show up. She rented her own sedan rather than accept the car service, preferring the anonymity of windows cracked and the radio off. She drove through neighborhoods that had changed considerably since the last time she'd had reason to visit. The waterfront had been redeveloped. New hotels stood where an old cannery once had. Banners along the lamp posts read Caldwell Heights, moving forward together, with Mayor Gordon Ashford's name printed discreetly at the bottom. She had read everything published about Ashford in the past 18 months. What hadn't been published was considerably more interesting. Gordon Ashford was 56, silver-haired, possessed of the kind of easy confidence that came less from competence than from a lifetime of being told he belonged wherever he stood. He had served as mayor for 6 years, was deep into a campaign for a second re-election, and his approval rating currently sat at 61%. His daughter's approval rating, had such a thing ever been measured, would have told a considerably different story. Brielle Ashford was 26 years old and had spent her entire life inhabiting a world that bent around her. She was Gordon's only child, raised in the shadow of his ambitions, without ever being required to develop any ambitions of her own beyond the maintenance of her own comfort. She moved through Caldwell Heights' social landscape with the absolute assurance of someone who had never once considered that the landscape might not be designed for her specifically. Off the record, the reporters who covered her socially were considerably less charitable than their published copy suggested. A server screamed at in 2019, a parking dispute quietly. Disappeared by a call from City Hall, a former friend who'd attempted to go public with a story about Brielle's behavior and inexplicably declined to give further interviews once the conversation had concluded. These things happened. They were managed. That was the particular nature of being Gordon Ashford's daughter in Caldwell Heights. Vivian had not come back to the city because of Brielle. She'd come back because of a man named Walter Ngozi, who had served 11 years as deputy director of the city's infrastructure procurement office before being quietly reassigned to a desk position with no staff and no authority. Walter had reached out to her 3 months earlier through a mutual contact. He had documents. He had emails. He had, most importantly, the kind of institutional memory that could not be deleted or shredded because it lived inside a person who had been present for every meeting where the minutes had been kept deliberately vague. Tonight, she was meeting him at the Meridian, the most expensive restaurant in Caldwell Heights. Walter's suggestion, on the theory that it was the last place anyone would think to look for them. Vivian had agreed. She had also noted, privately, that it was exactly the kind of place where, if something went wrong, there would be plenty of witnesses. She arrived at 7:43, gave her name to the host, and was led to the quiet VIP section near the back. She ordered water, checked her phone. Walter was 10 minutes out, and folded her hands on the table, waiting with the particular patience of someone who understood that the most important moments rarely arrived on schedule. I want to step briefly outside what Vivian witnessed directly, because there's a detail about how Walter found his way to her that matters for understanding the trust required on both sides of this arrangement. Walter Ngozi was 64 years old, 2 years from his own retirement, with a wife managing early-stage Parkinson's and a mortgage he had no intention of leaving unpaid by walking away from his pension out of principle alone. He had spent 11 years writing things down, not out of malice, but out of the lifelong professional habit of someone who understood that institutional memory was fragile and that the only honest way to protect it was on paper, in a safe at home, where it could outlast whatever happened to the person who'd written it. When his reassignment came, quiet, deliberate, a message disguised as administrative routine, he had spent 3 weeks deciding whether 30 years of careful caution was worth abandoning for a younger stranger's phone number passed along by someone he trusted exactly enough to make the introduction. He chose Vivian specifically when the introduction offered him a list of 3 possible investigators because her reputation suggested someone who would take the time to actually understand what he was risking before she used what he gave her. He was not wrong about that. Vivian didn't hear Brielle Ashford arrive so much as feel her, the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, conversations tilting, glances redirecting toward a person who had spent years commanding exactly that kind of attention. Brielle came in with 4 companions, dressed for spectacle, trailing expensive perfume and laughter louder than the room required. The host greeted her by name. She didn't thank him. She surveyed the room the way a general surveys a field, assessing, categorizing, dismissing, and her eyes landed on Vivian with a particular pause, the look of someone encountering something that didn't fit her established categories. An older, black woman, alone, dressed simply but without the diminished posture Brielle had learned to expect from people she decided didn't belong in rooms like this one. Vivian noticed the pause. She returned her attention to the table. Brielle's group settled 2 tables away, close enough for their conversation to become an ambient presence, names and references meant to be overheard. She ordered champagne without consulting the wine list. A remark surfaced, loud enough to carry, about certain people thinking they could sit anywhere these days. One of her friends giggled. The comment was aimed at no one in particular and everyone in particular at once, designed to be heard without being attributable to a target who could object to it directly. Vivian said nothing. She wanted Walter to arrive. She wanted the documents. She wanted to be finished with this particular evening. But Brielle Ashford had never learned to leave things alone. She made another remark, something about standards slipping, and then she stood. Vivian heard the chair scrape, but did not look up. Brielle crossed the distance in 4 steps, and Vivian could feel the room's attention shift toward their corner like a held breath spreading outward. "Excuse me." Brielle's voice was pleasant and precise, the voice of someone told her whole life she was articulate. "I think you might be in the wrong section." Vivian looked up, met her eyes. "I don't think so." Something flickered across Brielle's face, surprise at the absence of deference, a recalibration she clearly wasn't used to performing. "This area is reserved. I have a reservation." The flickering hardened into something else. Brielle was not accustomed to being contradicted in a single declarative sentence offered without apology, and the absence of that apology seemed to be precisely what ignited the sequence that followed. There were words, Brielle's, mostly clipped and escalating, the grievances of someone mistaking her own discomfort for injustice. Vivian responded once more, briefly, without raising her voice. And then Brielle Ashford, in front of 43 people, who would later give statements, raised her right hand and brought it across Vivian's face. The sound was flat and definitive. The room went completely still. Brielle stood there, with her hand still half raised, and the smile that crossed her face in the seconds after was automatic, the reflex of someone who expected the world to absorb what she'd just done and rearrange itself accordingly, the way it always had. Vivian reached up and, very carefully, touched the corner of her mouth. She examined her fingertips. She set them back down on the table. Then she reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and removed her phone. Her face, for those 43 witnesses, remained entirely composed. She dialed a number she knew by memory and pressed the phone to her ear. "Renee," Vivian said. "It's time." "Yes. We're ready. The Meridian. I'll explain when you get here." A pause. "Thank you." She set the phone face down on the table. "That's it," Brielle said, her triumph already curling at the edges into something less certain. "You're going to sit there and make a phone call." Vivian poured herself a glass of water from the carafe, took a sip, set it down and waited. The next 9 minutes were the longest Brielle Ashford had ever experienced, though she didn't yet know she was experiencing them. She returned to her table, finished her champagne, ordered another, made conversation that grew increasingly effortful, the particular strain of laughter produced by someone also, beneath it, listening for something they couldn't yet name. At the 8-minute mark, one of her friends looked toward the entrance and went quiet. At 9 minutes, Brielle looked too. 3 black SUVs had parked along the curb outside, engines off, occupants already moving with the efficient purpose of people who'd been briefed and were simply waiting for the signal. A woman in her mid-50s came through the door, silver-streaked hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring whether it looked intentional and arrived instead at the point where it simply looked right. She moved through the restaurant without glancing left or right, directly to Vivian's table. "Vivian." "Renee." Vivian rose briefly. "Thank you for coming." Renee Castellan had been appointed Federal Special Inspector General 18 months earlier, a position created specifically for a broad scope investigation into municipal corruption in mid-sized American cities. She opened a leather portfolio. "The warrant is signed. The team is staged. We can move tonight or tomorrow, depending on where you are." Vivian began to speak. Renee listened with the attentiveness of someone receiving information she'd waited a long time to receive. Brielle watched all of this from 2 tables away, the first real fear she'd felt in years settling into her chest like cold water. Walter arrived 18 minutes after Renee, sitting at the table with the contained, deliberate stillness of a man who had made a decision costing him a great deal and had resolved not to undo it. He carried a small encrypted drive and a handwritten letter he described as his formal statement. What he'd brought completed 6 years of documentation Vivian had spent 3 months verifying a city infrastructure contract for water treatment upgrades awarded in the spring of Ashford's first term to a company called Meridian Structural Solutions, no relation to the restaurant, though Vivian had privately noted the coincidence with a grim sense of irony. The contract was worth $140 million. Independent engineering. Assessments indicated the actual scope of work could have been completed for approximately $89 million. The $51 million difference had moved through a series of shell companies into the hands of 11 individuals, 7 connected to Ashford's campaign infrastructure, 2 on boards he'd personally appointed, 1 his own brother-in-law. There were 4 other contracts. Walter had known about all of them because he had been present in the room every time, and because he was the kind of man who wrote things down out of the lifelong belief that institutional memory was too fragile to trust to anyone's recollection alone. Brielle had stopped pretending not to watch. She heard her father's name. Spoken, not shouted, not accusatory, just spoken in the course of conversation, the way you speak a fact among other facts. She felt something cold move through her she didn't yet have language for. Gordon Ashford received his emergency call at 11:47 that night, still in his dinner clothes, reviewing polling numbers with his chief of staff. He listened with the expression of a man who'd built a structure he believed stronger than it actually was. He asked 3 questions. He ended the call and stood at his window for a long time without moving. His first response, in the days that followed, was the response of a man accustomed to making problems disappear. Lawyers, phone calls to people who owed him favors, statements characterizing the investigation as politically motivated. He also made calls of a different kind, 2 witnesses in Walter's chain received visits from people they didn't recognize, carrying language carefully worded to stop just short of explicit threat. Vivian received an anonymous email informing her that her investigative license was under review, that it would be in her professional interest to redirect her attention elsewhere. She read it twice, forwarded it to Renee's office, and didn't respond. The public hearing convened on a Thursday in September, the Civic Center hall filled to its 300-seat capacity. Ashford arrived with his legal team and the bearing of a man committed entirely to a posture of confidence. He spoke for 12 minutes, characterizing the investigation as political vengeance against a reformist mayor. Then Vivian stood. She presented for 47 minutes. No theatrics, no rhetorical flourish, just documents, dates, numbers, names, laid out in sequence with the clarity of someone who had spent 3 decades ensuring every fact she presented could survive independent verification. She traced each payment through its shell structure to its eventual resting place. She named the 11 individuals and their relationships to the mayor. Several committee members who'd begun the session visibly skeptical stopped looking. Skeptical somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Brielle sat in the gallery, having come out of the obstinate loyalty of a daughter who felt she owed her father her presence. She recognized her uncle's company name on the screen. She recognized dates that corresponded to conversations she'd half overheard over the years and chosen not to examine, because there are things you don't look at closely when your life is built on the foundation of someone else's reputation. She did not cry in the hearing room. She sat very straight, her face still, watching something unfold she couldn't prevent. The final witness appeared during the afternoon session, David Park, 34, a former recording secretary for the mayor's private senior staff meetings, who had resigned without public explanation 14 months earlier. He set a tablet on the witness table and pressed play. 42 seconds of audio. Gordon Ashford's voice, brisk and specific, directing the precise mechanism by which a contract would be awarded and funds distributed, including the phrase, "the same way we handled the Riverside account," corresponding directly to a contract Vivian had already presented. The room went very quiet. Ashford sat motionless for several seconds, then conferred with his attorney, who requested a recess. By morning, 2 major campaign donors had suspended financial support. By noon, his party's state chair had called for cooperation with federal investigators. By the following week, internal polling showed his approval collapsed from 61% to 23%. He resigned on a Monday morning. In a written statement, his communications director read aloud, because Gordon Ashford did not appear in person to deliver it himself. The statement cited a desire to prioritize his family. It did not use the word sorry. Brielle lost things gradually, and then all at once, the way most things are. Lost that were never entirely hers to begin with. Her friends from that night dispersed over the following weeks, with the efficiency of people who had always been calculating and had simply revised their calculations. The video of the slap, captured on 3 different phones, became the image, permanently attached to her name. She found Vivian through a mutual contact, asked to meet, and gave no reason. Vivian agreed, which surprised her. They met at a coffee shop on the east side of the city, the kind of unremarkable place where neither of them would be recognized. Brielle arrived first, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and spent 12 minutes rehearsing what she intended to say. When Vivian sat down across from her, Brielle looked at her directly for the first time since the Meridian, not as a category, not as a target, but as a person. "I'm sorry," she said. "I need you to know that I know it was wrong, and I know an apology doesn't fix it, and I'm not here because I want something from you. I just needed to say so to your face." Vivian was quiet a moment. "I appreciate you coming." Her voice was even, without performance. "I don't carry it as a wound. But I want you to understand something. The way you treated me in that restaurant, that wasn't about me specifically. I could have been anyone who fit the shape of what you'd already decided didn't belong there. You made a calculation about who I was based on what I looked like, how old I looked, where I was sitting. You acted on it before you'd ever actually looked at me." She let that settle. "That's the thing worth examining. Not what happened to your father. Not what happened to you afterward. The moment before, why you made that calculation in the first place." Brielle looked down at her coffee. "I've been thinking about it. Good. Power doesn't make anyone large. It just makes their choices louder. What makes someone large is how they treat people from whom they have nothing to gain." Brielle was quiet for a moment, her voice smaller when she spoke again. "I want to do something useful with whatever I have left. I know that sounds self-serving. I need to do something that isn't for me." "Then do it," Vivian said. "Find something worth doing. Do it badly at first. Get better at it. That's all it ever is." Brielle did find something, slower than she expected, less dramatic than she'd imagined, because useful work rarely announces itself dramatically. She began volunteering at a community legal aid organization on the south side, a part of the city she'd previously only seen from the back seat of cars headed somewhere else. She was not good at it initially. She made mistakes born of assumption, spoke when she should have listened, brought solutions to problems not yet fully explained to her. She learned slowly, through patient correction and occasionally unhappy feedback, that the most useful thing she could offer in most rooms was attention, without an agenda. She had not previously understood what that felt like. She stayed long enough to learn it properly. Gordon Ashford was indicted on 7 counts that winter. Walter Ngozi received a formal letter clearing his record, quiet acknowledgement for 11 years of being sidelined for doing his job correctly, no adequate remedy for the years themselves, but at least the restoration of the account. The infrastructure contract was rebid transparently and awarded at 31% below the original cost. Vivian did not stay for the trial's outcome. She packed her rental car on a Friday morning and drove the same route she'd entered the city by, the banners along the lampposts already taken down, the lampposts standing bare in the morning light. She drove to the row house, where she'd grown up decades before any of this, and parked outside it for a while. A different family lived there. Now, toys in the front yard, a bicycle chained to the railing. She thought about herself at 25, certain the systems of accountability meant something, fired within a week for being right too early. She had not been wrong. She had simply been alone for longer than anyone should have to be. This time, the system had worked faster than it ever had for her. That mattered, even if it had taken 35 years to watch it happen for someone else instead. She started the car and drove toward the highway, the radio on for the first time since she'd arrived, a habit she allowed herself only when leaving, windows down, the morning opening ahead of her into whatever city, whatever file came next. Narrator reflection: I keep returning to the 9 minutes between the slap and the SUVs. The specific patience required to sit in a restaurant, having just been struck, in public, and simply drink water, while waiting for the consequences to arrive on their own schedule. That patience didn't come from nowhere. Dr. Vivian Holloway Price earned it across 35 years, starting from a moment when no one offered her the same courtesy she was now extending to the machinery of accountability, the courtesy of trusting it would eventually do its job. AARP's research on age-related bias documents something worth sitting with. Specifically in this story, older women, and particularly older Black women, frequently experience what researchers describe as a kind of double invisibility in public spaces associated with wealth and status, judged simultaneously as too old to matter and too visibly out of place to belong. A calculation made in seconds, often before a single word is exchanged. Brielle didn't need to know anything true about Vivian to decide she didn't belong in that section. She only needed a snap impression built from decades of unexamined assumption about who occupies rooms like that one. What stays with me isn't only what Vivian endured. It's what she chose to do with the power she eventually held over Brielle's future, not humiliation in return, not performance, just one clear, unhurried sentence about the calculation itself, delivered once, in a coffee shop, without an audience. That restraint is its own kind of discipline, the same one that let her sit still for 9 minutes in a restaurant, with her dignity completely intact. Have you ever made a snap judgment about someone's place in a room, their age, their appearance, whether they belonged, before you'd actually looked closely enough to know anything true about them? What would it take to notice yourself doing that in the moment before the decision is already made? Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for reflective and entertainment purposes. The intersection of age-based and racial bias experienced by older Black women in public and professional spaces reflects documented patterns. AARP maintains research and resources on age discrimination at AARP.org. The Harvard Implicit Association Project provides further research on intersectional bias and its measurable effects at implicit. Harvard.edu. If you or someone you know has experienced discrimination based on age, race, or their intersection, both organizations offer accessible resources for understanding and addressing these patterns.